Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Downey, and today we are going to talk about the most potent steroid combination. And I'm going to say steroid in inverted commas because these aren't really steroids. However, whilst they aren't steroids, most people or lay people might refer to them as steroids or just performance-enhancing drugs. And this combination that I'm going to outline just now is probably the reason why we have mass monsters these days. So some might already have guessed the combination, but it's essentially insulin and growth hormone. So I'm going to look at them separately and then together, and we'll see why it is quite a potent stack that is favored by the typical mass monster. So whilst a lot of this evidence is still anecdotal because they don't really look at insulin and GH in combination that often, I'll be drawing on a lot of molecular data that we have on these two compounds. So the reason I say these are more potent and perhaps more potent than your traditional androgenic anabolic steroids is because they don't seem to have a point of plateauing, essentially. With anabolic steroids, you can constantly increase the dose. However, after a certain point, you're not going to get much of a return in terms of muscle gain, and you'll probably suffer from more side effects. So in the 90s, this combination came about, and this is probably what led to the emergence of these mass monsters. So first, we're going to be looking at insulin, and we'll see how insulin works and why it is quite potent at building muscle. Now, I must caution viewers, insulin is a very dangerous drug that can lead to death, so I advise against it in almost all circumstances. So many people think insulin works by increasing glucose uptake into the muscle and the liver and other tissues. However, this isn't actually the main mechanism of action, or the main way it reduces your blood sugar levels. In fact, it potently stops the liver from producing and releasing glucose into the bloodstream, and this has more of an effect on your glucose levels than the increased uptake. Furthermore, insulin doesn't actually increase per se the uptake of glucose into the muscle, it just increases the amount of transporters you have on the cells. The rate at which your muscles uptake glucose is actually dependent on the concentration gradient between your serum glucose levels and the glucose levels within the muscle or the tissue we're looking at. And in fact, in hyperglycemic states, once you inject insulin into a person with hyperglycemia, glucose uptake actually doesn't increase. This has been shown in multiple studies. In fact, when you have hyperglycemia or this increased level of sugar in your blood, the glucose uptake is higher than that of when you inject insulin. This is mainly dependent on that concentration gradient. So many people will also think that insulin increases glucose metabolism. It doesn't do this directly, it does it indirectly by improving glucose transport into the cell and thus into the Krebs cycle and other cycles. So I just want to further emphasize that insulin's action on decreasing blood glucose levels is actually mostly liver dependent. It decreases hepatic or liver glucose production. So why is insulin thought to be a good performance-enhancing drug? Well, we don't have too much data. We have some data in critical care patients where they've created a state of hyperinsulemic euglycemia, essentially where the individual had IV dextrose into their blood system as well as insulin, but the blood sugar levels were kept constant, and the state of hyperinsulinemia actually caused quite a significant decrease in muscle catabolism and actually increased muscle mass quite significantly. So let's look at various ways through which insulin could be beneficial from a performance-enhancing aspect in sports. Well, firstly, it obviously facilitates glucose entry into the cell. And by doing this, it increases cellular respiration through more glucose being available for respiration, as well as it increases glycogen formation within cells. And glycogen stores, whilst research is limited, is thought to be very beneficial pre-competition, especially in endurance sports. Furthermore, if you create high levels of insulin post-workout, there seems to be a greater level of glycogen stores and store recovery after exercise, which leads to better recovery as well as stamina. And lastly, let's look at how it could potentially be beneficial from a muscle building aspect. So not only does it help you recover from your exercise and perhaps increase performance within the gym, it actually works mainly through inhibition of protein breakdown. This is its main mechanism. It actually doesn't directly stimulate protein synthesis, but it does inhibit protein catabolism. And we'll show just now how that is very beneficial in the standpoint of insulin plus growth hormone. Furthermore, it would increase muscle size purely through increasing glycogen stores within the muscle. But there is more data coming out that actually insulin does indirectly stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and this is mostly through the actions of IGF-1. We also do have a lot of data in long-term diabetics which show that they have higher muscle mass than the general public. So that's just a short synopsis on how insulin could benefit one from a performance enhancement aspect. So let's look at growth hormone. So for a lot of people, growth hormone is known as the partitioning agent. It's actually known as the partitioning agent by a lot of cattle farmers, and that's because it preferentially diverts calories from food towards protein synthesis and less towards fat synthesis. And this has been shown in a lot of old age adults where the administration of exogenous growth hormone reduces their abdominal fat. And whilst reducing their abdominal fat, it creates an increase in their lean body mass. So let's look briefly at the pharmacokinetics and dynamics of growth hormone. So essentially, after it's secreted from the pituitary or injected intravenously, it has a half-life of about 15 to 20 minutes. After injecting it subcutaneously, so into the fat, it tends to peak around 1 to 3 hours, and then falls to an undetectable level at around 24 hours post-injection. Growth hormone is degraded by the liver and the kidneys, and the way they do this is that growth hormone binds to receptors on these organs, and then the growth hormone is internalized into the cell and broken down. Growth hormone tends to be secreted at greater levels during deep sleep, and it's found that those with sleep apnea or any disturbance in sleep tend to have lower growth hormone levels. Growth hormone secretion tends to peak around your late teenage years, and it slowly tapers off from there. And this has created the new phenomenon that we call somatopause, which is essentially where elderly individuals have subphysiological levels of growth hormone, and there's some research looking into whether or not they need exogenous growth hormone administration. So whilst it's thought that growth hormone mostly mediates its effects through IGF-1, growth hormone itself actually does stimulate a few receptors in the body. And in fact, there's a bit of controversy around IGF-1. So growth hormone increases IGF-1 secretion in pretty much all tissues. However, the IGF-1 tends to work locally in most tissues, except from the liver. The liver actually secretes this IGF-1, and we use that IGF-1 reading to see whether or not GH is taking an effect in the body. And research has suggested that looking at IGF-1 levels is more of an indication of growth hormone's effect on the liver, because they looked at mice without this IGF-1 producing gene, and it was found that the outcomes were more or less the same. So this IGF-1 level is more of a marker of growth hormone's effect on the liver as opposed to growth hormone's effect in general. Another random fact that is important for the end of this video is that portal insulin levels, so insulin levels within the portal system, which is essentially the blood system that involves the liver and the gut, is a key regulating factor of growth hormone receptors and receptor expression. So we have an idea now as to why growth hormone is thought to be a good performance enhancing drug, and that's because it has this partitioning effect. And in a lot of studies it's demonstrated that growth hormone at least has the same amount of anabolic ability as testosterone, although that data is contested because it's low quality. But what they found is that when growth hormone is paired with testosterone replacement, the effects seem to be synergistic and produce a greater effect than those observed in just using testosterone or growth hormone by themselves. And it's important to remember that GH itself has these lipolytic effect or fat burning effects, and IGF-1, whilst is a potent anabolic peptide, has weaker effects on this lipolysis. So I'll show a little diagram now as to why insulin and growth hormone are commonly used in combination and why they're thought to be so potent. So I'll display it on the screen. And as we can see here, both GH and IGF-1 act in this autocoid manner, which is essentially where it positively stimulates protein synthesis, and insulin acts as this colonic compound. Essentially what this means is it doesn't directly stimulate protein synthesis, but it decreases protein breakdown. So essentially you're creating this space where you are increasing protein synthesis without losing much to protein catabolism. The synergistic effects between growth hormone and insulin have been demonstrated in a few studies. They've shown that if you administer growth hormone to a type 1 diabetic who is fasting in this hypoinsulinemic state, since type 1 diabetics do not produce insulin, the growth hormone is in fact catabolic and leads to ketosis. This demonstrates why growth hormone and insulin are kind of codependent. And whilst there isn't much data and a lot of this is anecdotal, this pathway is thought to be the reason why we have more mass monsters these days. This is because it's commonly thought that the androgenic anabolic steroid pathway tends to plateau, and at increased dosages, the extra anabolic effect you get is minimal. Whereas with growth hormone and insulin, the anabolic effects of increasing the dose don't seem to taper off. Now, we don't have much data on this. However, it's commonly thought that this is the reason why mass monsters can sustain this high amount of muscle mass that is far beyond their genetic potential. So I'd just like to know what you guys think about growth hormone and insulin. Obviously, insulin is very dangerous and should not be used, but I just want to know your opinions on the insulin and growth hormone hypothesis as to why we have mass monsters and whether or not you think this is true or not. Furthermore, I'd like to know if you yourself have experimented with these compounds and whether or not you thought they were as anabolic as the molecular research would suggest they are. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next